So I just want to welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar From Risk to Resilience. And we are going to kick things off now. I'm Nicole. I'm your moderator for the session. And today we're joined by two incredible experts, Eric Greenwald, General Counsel at Finite State, and Dr. Amit Elazari, co-founder and CEO of Open Policy. So welcome to you both, and thank you for being with us. Over the next 45 minutes or so, we're going to cover a lot. The latest regulations like EU CRA and the US Cyber Trust Mark. We're also going to cover why acting on compliance now will set your teams up for success, and then how to turn compliance into a competitive advantage. So quick reminder, we are going to be accepting questions. We are going to hear from our experts, but also really want to hear from you too. Please ask your questions along the way. I will be managing the Q&A portion of the Zoom panel. So submit your questions there. We'll pull those questions in, as many as we can get to throughout the presentation. Just also a housekeeping reminder, we will be sending the presentation to everyone after the event. So anyone joining late or registering later, we will get the slides and the video recording out to everyone in the next day or so. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And to kick things off, I would love to hear from you, Eric, and you, Amit. Can you please give us a bit about your respective backgrounds and help us understand how cybersecurity regulations have become a focus for you? So I'll go to Eric first on that question.
Sure. Thanks, Nicole. I really appreciate it. And as Nicole mentioned, I'm the general counsel for Finite State. I've been with Finite State for about 4 years now, and in the tech sector generally for, I guess, almost a decade. Prior to that, I had a long career in government where I was doing a lot of work in intelligence, national security, cybersecurity, and cyber operations. I spent a number of years as the chief counsel for the House Intelligence Committee, and then was at Cyber Command right as it stood up, and I was the deputy director for operations at Cyber Command before moving over to the FBI, where I was the deputy director of the NCIJTF, National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force. And then my last job in government was at the White House, where I was the senior director for cybersecurity on the National Security Council. And it was through those jobs, but particularly in the last one, that I had my greatest exposure to the question of cybersecurity regulation, where, at that time, there was a sense of a need for government to step in and try to encourage, and I use that word deliberately, companies to improve their cybersecurity practices, but there was not much willingness to require them to improve their cybersecurity practices. And it was a big struggle to try to figure out how to do this in a way that would actually lead to improvements in cybersecurity across the board without imposing specific regulations. But as we'll talk about in a little bit, the game has changed from when I was at the White House. Amit, over to you.
Fantastic. And it's such a pleasure to be here with you today. Thanks for joining us. It is a special moment indeed, because today the European CRA Cyber Resilience Act was published on the official journal. So we do have a very clear timeline. We're going to talk about that. So a little bit about myself and my passion to cyber policy. So I'm a lawyer by training, and the accent you're hearing is from Israel, born and raised in Tel Aviv. And was working in cybersecurity and technology law, had the opportunity to go to UC Berkeley to do my doctoral degree in the law, so a JSD, which is a third degree in the law, where I still teach. And while I was there, really at the cutting edge of technology law and policy law issues, my sister, who is a hacker, told me all about bug bounty hackers and this universe of anti-hacking laws. And I ended up doing significant research in that space, co-founding Disclose.io, and researching it at Berkeley. Then went to Intel, where I had the honor to spend 4.5 years ultimately as the head of cyber policy for Intel Corporation. So I was looking at the arc of all these regulations, policies, standards that are coming out from the perspective of the entire impact of a global manufacturer with a lot of products in security, a lot of impact. And I was very honored to chair a couple of public policy committees in this space and also lead an international standard on product security. And after learning this profession and really engaging in policy at the top level in a multinational company, I started Open Policy. And Open Policy is a company that is tech enabling with AI access to policy at scale for amazing innovative companies, including in security. And Finite State is one of our customers, very early adopter of Open Policy. And through Open Policy, we're really using our AI and our expertise. We see the breadth of global requirements that are coming, the standards implementations, the policies. And what is really fascinating is this focus on product, focus on critical infrastructure, Internet of Things, manufacturing requirements in cybersecurity, which is a moment that started in 2018 after the Mirai botnet, but is really maturing now. So through Open Policy and my passion to cyber policy, I'm very honored to be working with Finite State and kind of in a coalition fashion, looking at what's coming and be able to work with policymakers on actually defining these policies. So a lot of the work we're doing, seeing kind of the arc of what's coming. And I think this is an exceptional moment to embrace policy. And we really are seeing that organizations that are ahead of the curve, seeing what's coming and preparing for these compliance requirements, are moving from just looking at compliance as a burden and really looking, shifting to security as a competitive advantage. And with the avalanche of exposure and regulation coming, there has never been a better moment to be plugged into the policy conversation. So we have a fascinating webinar ahead, and I'm so excited to be here with you.
Can you give us a brief overview of the current regulatory landscape? Love to hear from both of you on this. Thank you.
Sure, and I'll start out by linking to what I was saying with respect to my own background and experience with cybersecurity regulation, that if you go back a decade or even just 5 years, you will see, at least when you focus on the US government, a real reluctance to impose actual requirements on companies with respect to cybersecurity practices. You saw more willingness in the defense sector than anywhere else, because the Department of Defense was, it was, I think, deemed reasonable that the Department of Defense might impose some requirements on vendors, companies selling directly into the Department of Defense. And so they imposed some pretty basic breach notification requirements and a few other bits and pieces, but really it was not much. And if you fast forward to just a couple of years ago with the adoption of Executive Order 14028, you started to see a real sea change in the way that the United States government was approaching regulatory matters. And concurrently, you saw in the EU, where traditionally there is less institutional and historical resistance to imposing regulations on companies, but still, I think, a lack of understanding of exactly what was going to be useful, helpful, or even meaningful in terms of cybersecurity regulation. I think we have passed both those points. That I think the US government, while there's still some reluctance to impose significant regulatory burdens on companies, and certainly the incoming Trump administration is likely to be less willing than the Biden administration has been to do so, there is still, I think, a general understanding that there's an imperative behind improving, not just encouraging, but requiring companies to improve their cybersecurity practices. The US government cannot protect US cybersecurity on its own. It needs private companies, private entities to be doing as much as they can. And what you are seeing at the same time as you're experiencing the sea change in both the US and the EU with respect to a willingness to impose cybersecurity regulations is a capacity to do so, and that is they've been building over time the institutional processes and the technical requirements necessary to actually impose meaningful, detailed technical standards. And I don't want to emphasize meaningful too much, because in a lot of ways, the requirements that are out there just scratch the surface. If you think about what a CISO at a sophisticated, especially technology company or industrial company, has to do, it's way more than what these regulations impose. I will say, and I'm curious to know if Amit agrees, that what we're seeing now with respect to the EU in the Cyber Resilience Act is going a little bit beyond the basic blocking and tackling of cybersecurity requirements to something that is, a little bit more technical and I think a bit more meaningful. But still, it is really just the basics, what should be the baseline for what companies should be doing on their own. But this is a separate question of what governments are going to require these companies to do. But what you're seeing, because both the US and the EU and other regimes are starting to develop cybersecurity regulations, is that there is essentially a mutually reinforcing process where they're all able to gravitate around standards that are fairly common. And again, this is partly because there is some sense of what basic blocking and tackling should look like in cybersecurity. And what the helpful part of this is that when you're in compliance with one regime, you are at least in significant measure compliant with other regimes that are out there. It's not quite that simple, not quite that straightforward, because in addition to having their own individual technical requirements, there's of course process that you need to follow, whether it's declarations or certifications or third-party self-attestations or third-party attestations that you need to obtain. So the actual navigation of all these compliance regimes is going to be quite complex, particularly for companies that are going to be subject to more than one regime, US, EU, or other. But it at least provides some critical mass, center of gravity around which all these compliance practices can revolve. But I think the most important thing that I'd like to make note of, and something that we're going to talk about today, is that while these security regimes are generally speaking targeted at companies that sell products, whether it's an actual physical digital product or a digital service into the particular geographic region where they apply, that the reach is much broader than that, both because it's not just companies that are, for example, in the EU that exist in the EU and sell their products, but any company, no matter where located, that sells products into the EU. But even more important is that all their suppliers, the suppliers to those companies that sell products, are going to need to be in compliance as well, because if you think about just device manufacturers, that all the suppliers to those device manufacturers, the device manufacturer is going to say, hey, I need the following from you so that I can be compliant with the EU CRA. And if you don't give me that, and give me that in a way that I can confidently say to the EU that I am in compliance, then I'm going to go find a different supplier. And that all is happening very quickly. It's worth noting that for those of you who are in the automotive industry, you were aware that the connected vehicle, or the proposed connected vehicle rule was issued just a couple of months ago, I guess not quite 2 months ago. And this is the proposed rule. The final rule we're expecting to come out sometime in early 2025. But within 1 week of that rule being, the proposed rule being issued, I was aware of an auto manufacturer that was issuing a request for proposal, and in that request for proposal, they were requiring the vendors that were submitting the RFPs to explain how they were going to be in compliance with the connected vehicle rule, even though it was still just a proposed rule. So this trickle down is real, and it's fast, and it's gaining speed. So again, it's very significant change from where we were back when I was still in government, and that there is momentum building behind that process. So there's a lot of work that companies need to do. I'm going to pause there because I think we're going to get into a lot of the details of some of the themes that I'm touching on as we're going through this webinar.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And let me just kind of highlight a few themes here. So yeah, just looking at the arc of IoT policy, cybersecurity for requirements for the OT, IoT, these areas. We started in 2018 with policymakers really recognizing we have a gap in baseline security requirements. So if you want to understand the trajectory of policy action, just follow the attacks, right? We have this theme where we're seeing an attack, let's say the Mirai botnet, which was a significant attack that was enabled because of default password. And then, a year after, you start seeing those standards, often voluntary, maybe states like California, starting with requirements in that space. We've seen that with Log4j, software security, SBOMs, Colonial Pipeline. So it's a common theme. And in 2018, we really saw the beginning of the baseline security movement, where really governments are expecting product manufacturers, organizations, to at least strive to have some baseline requirements of measures for cybersecurity. But the moment right now is significant because now the maturity of all these requirements are taking effect. We already have the standards. So folks that have been tracking this arc from 6 years ago, they have been starting to prepare. And what's significant is a couple of things. As Eric mentioned, policymakers in the US as well, not just in the EU, are no longer just relying on voluntary measures and self-attestation. It started with federal procurement, right? That high-risk vendor, DoD vendor ecosystem, but now it's proliferating for all critical infrastructures. And, things like the IoT Cyber Trust Mark, which is voluntary in nature, but we're expecting all the leading market players, and they've already committed to this, Google, Amazon, across the board, LG, to be doing that. So it's creating a best practice in the industry. And so this shift is from voluntary to required. Of course, the EU Cyber Resilience Act, which we're going to go into the details, is perhaps the most prominent example of that. But the other shift is moving from self-attestation, right, to much more robust certification. And this is where preparation ahead is critical, because it's, again, as Eric mentioned, it's no longer just the regulator, it's the whole supply chain of compliance. What your top, vendors, what your kind of big customers are requesting you, and also preparing for compliance, where you actually are required to produce those evidence, to provide those software bill of materials, produce the artifacts of compliance. So that is a big shift. The other piece is that we are no longer in the reasonable security land. Like folks that have been tracking policy might be aware that, Federal Trade Commission, other regulators looked at the threshold of cybersecurity as something that is looking at the reasonableness, maybe some NIST guidelines. Now we're really getting into the details. So we are going to talk about it with the EU Cyber Resilience Act, but we are now talking about at least 20 to 25 very detailed controls that go into the specificity of how many dependencies you have in your software bill of materials. The advantage of getting ahead of this is, instead of taking a piecemeal approach to your compliance, you can start thinking about the EU, the US, the sectors you provide to the vendors, and really look at it holistically, because we are seeing a very clear, trajectory of things you need to, have already in place if you want to market access Europe, right, in 2027. So we'll go into the details, but I think we have reached that maturity timeline. Folks are no longer in a position of just tracking, seeing how the regulation is maturing. And the biggest thing here and I think the NPRM is a great example, is the contractual supply chain. Like in other areas of, banking, other regulated industries, or even with the software bill of materials, we are recognizing that the big companies, the manufacturers, the multinationals, they are not going to take the risk. They are preparing already for the CRA, and they're going to be starting to prioritize suppliers, vendors that are on top of their game, are able to show not only how do they do security, but how they're helping their ecosystem to prepare for this regulatory moment. And this is where compliance and best practices security is becoming a competitive advantage.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the introductions that you gave. It was a great overview. I think it's a good opportunity. I know you've mentioned both that we want to go into some of the details on some of the specific regulations, and you mentioned CRA and the recent developments on that front. So do you mind just digging in a little bit more? We'll share with the audience some of those key requirements, and then we can go through the highlights of these, and then maybe toward the end talk about some of the convergence issues. And when a global manufacturer, for example, says they're operating globally, how do they balance compliance across all regions, and where does that convergence happen so that they can start to comply with different standards?
Fantastic. So I can get started here. I think it's also worth, we chatted a little bit about this theme, but from in our trackers, in our policy intelligence engines, and what we're seeing, there are at least about 30 to 40 significant IoT requirements, IoT and product security requirements that are moving as we speak. So it's an ever-evolving space. There are sectorial requirements. We talked about the automotive connected vehicle area, where I think, Eric, we can, after this slide, go back and talk a little bit about that. There are FDA specific requirements. So you're seeing pieces of these baseline security requirements being amplified and required in specific sectors as well. But if we look at the overarching moment, I think these are some of the significant things we have seen. So Cyber Resilience Act, in my view, the most significant cybersecurity horizontal regulation ever proposed and implemented. This is really a moment because we are no longer talking about the culture of fines like we have in incident reporting or we have with the GDPR, where something happens and you are exposed if you're not in compliance because you had a big data breach. We are talking about a shift to market access. So the manufacturer now has the accountability if it's a digital product, and that is defined very, very broadly. There is a lot of nuance, but that's defined very, very broadly. If it's a digital product, it's a connected product with digital elements, the manufacturer, in order to be able to get into Europe, to kind of have that product go into Europe, to have the CE mark, which is the system of whereby you have market access for your products, they're going to need to show that they are implementing the baseline security measures that are written into the CRA. And here we get into the specifics. We have secure by design. We have software bill of materials, we have vulnerability management, we have risk assessment, and we have very concrete requirements that manufacturers need to prepare for. Now, if you have complex supply chains, so you have a lot of components, it might take years because it's the products that are entering to the market. It might be a product that you started to produce right in 2015. If it's going into the market as of 27 December, you are required. Then there are earlier process-related requirements. Do you have a vulnerability disclosure program? Do you have the capabilities to produce those software bill of materials that are going into effect earlier? This is, for example, requirement on reporting on actively exploited vulnerabilities. This means that you need to put your plans and processes now. And the first place we're going to see this moving forward is through the contractual supply chain. Multinationals, manufacturers are already starting to think about CRA. They're already requiring in contracts, they're requiring evidence on how folks are getting prepared, because the end manufacturer, the OEM, that product manufacturer is accountable for their entire supply chain. And this is really considerable. Penalties, very significant, can get up to 2.5%. So this is a very serious regulation. And as I mentioned, we are in a market access regulation. If you think about why they changed to the common charger, we all know there are significant regulations enforced through the CE mark system. So this is the moment. It's worth noting that this is not the first time we've seen software bill of materials, software inventory, composition, vulnerability management based on requirements here in the federal procurement space in the United States. The EO 14028 that is now being implemented, and we are expected that it will continue to be implemented through this administration, because it's really much baked into the contractual supply chains, have these robust requirements. And folks they're not able to show how they're producing the SBOM and are not able to showcase how they're attesting to the self-attestation requirements of security, are not able to do business with the federal government. This too is trickling through the supply chain, where mega vendors that are supplying a lot of software into the federal government are requiring that from their subcontractors. And finally, the cyber trust mark, and all these areas, I absolutely welcome Eric's commentary on this as well. This is a voluntary program, but if you go into the details, you would see there are a lot of mutual requirements with the CRA. So again, I talked about that advantage of taking an holistic approach. Companies that are smart, that are looking at the CRA holistically with the SBOM requirements under the EO, the cyber trust mark, can have a much more holistic approach that differentiates their ability to capture all these different markets with a sound compliance program. Cyber Trust Mark, voluntary program for consumer IoT products. It's a label that showcases how each product that carries the label, and this is where we're really leaning on consumers to prioritize products that have those baseline security measures, are being able to demonstrate and have in that product that the product is exhibiting the security controls. And just to give some details, again, here we are seeing things like having an SBOM, having vulnerability management processes. So these are really common security baselines. And with that, over to you, Eric. I'm excited to hear your perspective on how all of this is going to evolve, right, with the new administration, and what's of note to our audience.
Yeah, and it is a little bit hard to predict exactly where the incoming administration is going to land on these things, but I think this is an inexorable trend. The requirements that are being imposed becoming more technical, more stringent, penalties becoming more severe, and again, because of the reach of the CRA, to a certain extent, even if the incoming administration is slower moving, more permissive on cybersecurity, companies throughout the United States, OEMs and suppliers, are going to have to get their game into a place where they're going to be able to comply with the CRA. What I want to do is circle back to what Amit was talking about with respect to enforcement mechanisms. And to begin that, I want to touch on GDPR, which was groundbreaking when it first came out, not just in the requirements that it was imposing for privacy, but in the penalties that it imposed. Now, you may have read stories about some of the very biggest tech companies getting hit with enormous penalties under the GDPR. And to be sure, those massive penalties were generally only rolled out against the biggest companies, in part because it's a function of their global turnover, a percentage of their global turnover. But what you don't generally see is all of the compliance activity, the scrambling that companies have done to avoid the scrutiny of EU privacy officers. If you get a question from a data protection authority in the EU, it becomes a very uncomfortable moment. You want to be able to demonstrate convincingly with clear documentation that you are fully in compliance with GDPR because of the penalties that they can impose and because of the measurements that they could require in order to avoid penalties. Now, flip over to the CRA, and we're talking about market access. And they have very flexible, wide-ranging tools that go all the way up to those massive kind of penalties that the GDPR can impose, but can also deny companies the ability to sell certain products in the EU, require certain mitigation measures in order to address risk that they see as a function of non-compliance with the CRA. And believe me, when companies that are selling into the EU are told, hey, we really think you ought to take the following mitigation measures in order to meet what we see as your deficiencies with respect to compliance, companies are going to move quickly to do that. And it is, as I think we'll discuss a little bit later in this webinar, it is far better to get yourself in a position where you are walking into the market in compliance rather than just waiting to be told how you're not in compliance and scrambling in an effort to avoid being denied market access or having heavy penalties imposed upon you to change your products in order to dodge those bullets. It is worth noting that the market access provision is something that you also see in the FDA's pre-market clearance for medical devices. This is a rule that went into place in October of 2023. And as soon as it was announced, even though there was a lot of handwriting on the wall, the final rule, I think, was announced some 6 or 8 months before it went into force. And companies were scrambling to get to a place where they could be in compliance. And the compliance for FDA pre-market clearance is relatively straightforward. It's definitely not as detailed and technical as CRA compliance. But the reason why companies were so concerned is that when you're applying for approval from the FDA when you're building a medical device, step number one is get approval from the FDA to be able to sell that device in the United States. If you don't get that approval, then you're completely out of luck. And so the FDA used that lever to say, you have an SBOM and vulnerability management processes that meet the following requirements, or we're not going to give you clearance to actually sell your product. And that turned out to be a very powerful lever. You see some of the same things in the connected vehicle rule, which has a different orientation and is much more focused around threat from Chinese and Russian software and hardware developers, and is frankly less about cybersecurity than it is about the provenance of the software and hardware that's going into a connected vehicle. But still, it is a market access rule, and that is, if you don't meet the requirements, if you can't if you are unable to issue a declaration of compliance, and or that you are not able to answer the Department of Commerce's questions or requirements satisfactorily, they will prohibit you from selling your vehicle in the United States. And these are very, very powerful mechanisms to get compliance. And again, that compliance starts with the OEM, but trickles down through the supply chain, because the OEM is not going to be in compliance if their suppliers aren't in compliance.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the in-depth overview of those 5 regulations that we chose to highlight. I'd like to move us over into, and we've covered some of this, but would really like to kind of dig into some of these key themes and the core overlapping requirements, so that we can really begin to help the OEMs understand where they need to focus in order to be compliant and to start acting now. So Amit, would you like to cover that one or get us started on that topic?
Sure. So I think this is kind of a common theme and question that I'm getting. It's really important to recognize there is a lot of synergy between what we call the baseline security requirements that are being required. For context, about 95% of the EU cyber trust mark requirements for security align with some of the EU Cyber Resilience Act, and we do have common standards across the board, like ETSI 34645, in the OT space 62443, that is expected to probably evolve to meet more of the security by design requirements in the CRA that are mutual, right? That are mutual across jurisdictions. If you go into Annex A, that Cyber Essential Requirements Annex within the CRA, you will notice about 3 pages of very detailed controls that are required across the board. But if we want to create common themes, here's what we can expect. First of all, inventory. Asset inventory. Those of you on the line who are familiar with NIST know that the concept of knowing what you have in your organization, in your stack, is foundational for risk assessment, which is one of the most critical activities. In the EU Cyber Resilience Act, really some of the requirements change based on risk. If you have higher risk products, right, they might require third-party certification versus self-attestation in kind of low risk categories, like some of the consumer IoT spaces. So how do you conduct a risk assessment? How do you manage risk? First of all, you need to know what are your assets, what is the composition of your product, what you have in the stack. So software composition, software bill of materials, in its very broad form, is a foundational control that is mutual into the EU Cyber Resilience Act, but is also discussed in the EU Cyber Trust Mark standards. It's in the FDA, it's in the NPRM. We just discussed about connected vehicles. But broader than that, in that secure by design, umbrella, that's where we see the third-party risk accountability, the asset inventory, the secure coding, right, following software secure development practices, and threat modeling, all of that emerging. And that is a foundation for perhaps the most prioritized requirement, which is updates and remediation. So finding the vulnerabilities with the highest risk of exploitability, vulnerability disclosure policies where you're working with third parties, right? Whether it's friendly hackers, right? Being able to consume third-party reports, but really being able to understand where you have vulnerabilities in the stack, what you need to prioritize and remediate. I think one of the most interesting pieces is that the regulations are putting together that need of knowing what you have together with vulnerability remediation. And if you don't know that you have in a stack a vulnerable component that has an actively exploited vulnerability, let's say it's an open source vulnerability like Log4j, you're exposed to big risk. In the CRA, the first requirement that go into effect is this requirement to report on actively exploited vulnerabilities. The implication of that is you need to have that software composition, risk assessment, remediation practices way ahead of that 2027 timeline, because you already need to report, right? If you have something that is getting exploited, that means you already need to know everything you have in your stack, and it absolutely can come from a third party. I think that's one of the biggest shifts, is that this idea that we need to hold someone accountable, and that's whoever it's incorporating, right, that vulnerable stack. Doesn't mean that it necessarily is the origin of the vulnerability, but if that is in the stack, you're accountable. Everything around identity and access management, tremendous push coming in those regulations, having secure interfaces, authentication, protection of data at rest, data in transit, secure default configuration. This is where we're seeing those concepts of, what we know in the US is kind of zero trust is proliferating with the secure by design, secure by default, culture, and the policies are using those terms. And this is, I think, where we're going to have the concept of secure by default evolving together with the attack surface. The standards are going to become critical, the delegated act, because we have here flexibility. The secure by design culture is not going to be static in time. It will evolve with the attacks, and manufacturers are going to need to work with best-in-class vendors like Finite State to be ahead of that curve, to really satisfy kind of that concept that will evolve together with attacks. Absolutely common across not just product regulation, also regulations and requirements that apply to the organization as an enterprise. Things like the EU directive NAS2 that is being implemented, in the US, the CERCIA, the cyber reporting, incident reporting, that is a critical component. What perhaps is the most interesting, development is this combination of organization level requirements like incident reporting for the enterprise together with the product requirements. So those are in kind of intertwining together, and you're seeing this with the EU NAS2 and the EU Cyber Resilience Act coming together. And of course, requirements around data. And I think, if you open up the CRA, you will notice that the EUA Act is being referenced. There is a reference for high-risk AI. So we're really seeing, all these kind of data security, AI requirements, the cybersecurity requirements coming together. So I want to leave it at that. I will, again, give a strong plug into the standards. We do not have ambiguity. Sure, there are going to be more delegated acts issued under the CRA, but the reality is that there are clear international standards, clear based on requirements, at 303, 645, 62443, ISO standards, NIST standards, and folks, vendors like Finite States are already working to, help manufacturers go through these controls. And the advantage is not taking a piecemeal approach. It's not to the benefit of the organization to try to deal with the FDA now and with the Trustmark now, and then approach the CRA in 2 years. You take an holistic approach towards your stack, you're minimizing your risk.
Amit, I actually want to ask you a question about the vulnerability reporting, since it's coming fairly soon under the CRA. The way I read that requirement, it is actively exploited vulnerabilities doesn't mean that your company is subject to an attack using this vulnerability, but just that you have a vulnerability that is being seen elsewhere, actively exploited. Is that right?
No, I think there's a lot of nuance there, because there are actually definitions, but I would call attention to the fact that it's not just that vulnerability reporting requirement. We have here, to my knowledge, it's the first time ever a requirement in the cyber essential requirement in the annex of products not becoming available to the market if they have known exploitable vulnerabilities. So it's a two-pronged approach. You have the reporting requirements. For that, it's a little bit of like the actively exploited is a little bit of a higher threshold. And if you think about it, you can understand the regulators. Today, they have under NIS2 requirements for enterprise level incidents. But what about products that are being, vulnerabilities that are getting exploited out there just because the vulnerability is emerging from a connected product, right? So they want to know about that. But in parallel to that requirement of reporting, they also put in place a very interesting, unprecedented requirement, which is you are not going to be making available products if they have a known exploitable vulnerability. So if you put that together, that is pretty significant. And I do want to, we can talk a little bit about the definition, but an actively exploited vulnerability, that is, I believe, a defined term here under the CRA, which is also kind of the first time we've seen that as well. So I just wanted to kind of highlight that two-pronged approach where, it's not just about the reporting of the actively exploited vulnerability, whatever you become aware of, it's also the requirement to make sure that, you're not putting in the market products with exploitable vulnerabilities. So two different definitions there. And maybe last word about that actively exploited. Yeah, I mean, it's as long as you have reliable evidence that a malicious actor has exploited it, you without the system, without the permission of the system owner, you became aware of this and now you need to report it. It has nothing to do whether it's your vulnerability or someone else's.
It's remarkable to think about the movement from where we were with Log4j and where we're going to land soon with the CRA. When Log4j was discovered, like the biggest challenge that most companies were facing was, do we have this? Where do we have it? And then it became a question of how do we mitigate it? And the CRA is expecting a lot more than that. It's in addition to the reporting requirements, as Amit noted, once the full force, once the CRA is fully enforced, if there's a known vulnerability, you can't ship a product with that known vulnerability. And then beyond that, based on the secure by design principles, if a new Log4j type vulnerability pops, then you are going to need to be able to have in place the ability to mitigate that and do so quickly. And I think we all know of companies, either first or secondhand knowledge, that had a terrible time trying to mitigate Log4j vulnerabilities. And those companies that, with the next Log4j, who are selling into Europe, who are, obviously having difficulty with the mitigation, they're going to start getting a side eye from the EU CRA authorities. And that could become an even more uncomfortable position, because not only are they in the middle of, struggling their way through remediation, but they're now looking at unwanted scrutiny from regulators and the possibility of, getting additional mitigation measures imposed upon them, potential denial of market access, and potential massive penalties. So this is all to say that the world is not just changing; it has changed. This steps a little bit away from the topic that we're on at the moment of overlapping requirements. And I'll just, I think Amit did an excellent job of summarizing those requirements and the way in which they interoperate across different regulatory regimes. So I'm not going to belabor that too much, especially because I know we want to get to questions before too long.
Yeah, maybe just a final note on that, Eric, because I do think like it's significant. This combination of having the requirements to have your SBOMs, your risk assessment, your full asset inventory, with the requirement to report any actively exploited vulnerability you become aware of. In that way, the regulators really close the gap, because they're not allowing you to not have software composition, SBOM awareness. They're requiring that. They're requiring the third-party risk assessment. And at the same time, they're requiring reported if you become aware. So if you're a manufacturer and you have that active exploitation in your stack, in your product, Now, again, you're accountable for that third risk. But I think, this fantastic focus on remediation, right? When it comes to also what's remediating, updating, what's exploitable is really creating here in the CRA the perfect combination. I think this has been because of a lot of learnings from Log4j, where it became clear, or even Colonial Pipeline, it became clear that folks are simply unaware where is the vulnerable piece. So you see here the regulators are closing the gaps systematically. SBOM, remediation, reporting, everything coming together.
And just to quickly touch on the question from David in the chat, because it's directly connected to that, you're absolutely right, David, that if there is a mitigation measure in place or a higher level component actually protects against the known vulnerability being exploited, then I don't think it qualifies. The trick is actually, understanding where the vulnerability is and whether those higher level components do in fact protect against it. And while that is a level of knowledge that is currently beyond a lot of companies. Many companies do a very good job of understanding their network environments and their products, but there are far too many that do not, that have not spent the resources on cybersecurity necessary to have that understanding, to be able to confidently say when a new vulnerability pops that there is a higher level mechanism that protects against exploitation of that known vulnerability.
All right, thank you so much. We're getting close to the end here, so I'll get us, I know that we covered a lot of this throughout the course of what you've shared, but just want to touch on really why manufacturers, why OEMs really need to take action now, and kind of surface these. I know, again, they've come through and some of the things that you've shared, but we want to kind of bring this front and center on why it's important to start thinking about and changing your processes today.
I'll jump in here first, and I'll just try to be quick. And starting with this first point about long development cycles, using the example of vehicles. The design life cycle for an automobile is minimum 3 years, and many are in the 4 to 5 year range. So, and this has come, the spotlight is shining on this in the context of the connected vehicle rule, where the Department of Commerce has proposed that software be subject to the rule basically, a little bit more than a year, or at least 1 year after the rule is implemented, which means potentially a little bit more than a year from now. And then for hardware, I think it's 3 years from the effective date. And this, like for auto manufacturers, this is concerning, because they need to go through and they need to figure out exactly what components are out of compliance with the connected vehicle rule, immediately figure out whether they can get a specific authorization for them, or if they can take mitigation measures necessary. Otherwise, they are going to need to design those components, software or hardware, out immediately. Even though the hardware enforcement date is a few years down the road, it is still something where OEMs need to know now what hardware they're going to be using for vehicles that are in the 2030 model year, which is the first model year for which it'll be enforced for hardware. But again, 2027 model year for software. So they're making those decisions right now, and the same thing is true for the other regimes that we're talking about that have a broader scope than just automotive. Where even though the full enforcement date for the CRA is not till the end of 2027, there are a lot of companies that have design cycles that require them to be able to make those decisions now. But of course, then, and this is the last thing I say before I pass it over to Amit, to echo what we've been saying for a couple different points in this conversation, is that you need to design it in from the beginning. If you're trying to bolt it on afterward, your cost could be higher and your solution could be worse, and you could end up getting penalties and be found out of compliance anyway. But I'll pause there and pass it over to Amit.
Yeah, no, I think this is, with what's coming up with policy, and this is why part of, we created open policy to have use AI and have policy intelligence and know the product strategy implications ahead of the curve, is we recognize that it's really not a good strategy to be trailing with everyone in the last moment and trying to prepare. There is a clear arc of product security baseline requirements coming in. The implications are clear. It's today published on the journal. So there is really no advantage of staying put, because I think again, we're going back to what changed. We are in an era where you might need to produce tons of artifacts of compliance, that the requirements on how you are preparing and you are ready to go with the CRA are contractual requirements by vendors, right? It's in the contractual supply chain, that it's no longer just self-attestation. You might need to prepare yourself for a third-party certification, working with the notified bodies, working with a third party to get to certification. That can take 2 years. Right. So, and this is before you count like the long life cycles of product development. Eric talked about automotive 3 years. In semiconductors and chip design, it can be more than 5 years. So there really is a compelling moment to start preparing early. I would say CISOs, product security officers that are ahead of the curve can ask for budgets. They can spend more time researching the amazing vendors that can work with them. And if they are prepared, ahead of the curve, it can become, I predict it will become a very significant competitive advantage in bidding processes, right? It's not just about, obviously we have the secure by design culture as a market differentiator with the market, and we have the compliance risk, but ultimately you really don't want to be in a position where you're head and head on a multi-million-dollar contract, even more, and the other party just showed how they're getting ready for compliance much better. I think we're going to see complete prioritization of regulatory readiness across all these themes. And frankly, when it comes to product security, these are longer processes. Software composition in product is harder. You're not going to be able to just get those SBOMs, like in the software stack, even with the power of AI, ready to go. And then when you see those type of processes, like designing the baseline controls into the product remediation, that can take time. So hopefully you are motivated. This is the perfect day and time to talk about this moment with the EU Cyber Resilience Act officially published in the journal. And we truly hope you're taking note.
Thank you so much. That was a coincidence that was published yesterday. We had nothing to do with that happening right before our webinar here, but it was very timely. Eric, we have a question in the chat for you. It's a good one.
Yeah. So there's a couple of components here. And first, Ray, thanks for the opportunity to clarify what I was saying earlier about the U.S. government needing companies to take security measures themselves. This is not saying the U.S. government needs private companies to help defend against state actors. But let me make a really rough analogy. You expect police to protect you from your home being burglarized, but that doesn't mean you should just leave your doors and windows open and put all your valuables out on your lawn. And so there's a general expectation that, hey, you need to take part in protecting your home and your possessions from robbery. Same thing with cybersecurity. Companies need to take a role and responsibility in providing for their own cybersecurity at the same time that they're relying upon the government to take care of certain elements. And battling state actors is probably the best example of where it is a primary responsibility for the government. But again, that doesn't mean that the private sector, that individuals have no role. It's just that is the fundamental responsibility of the U.S. government. I'm not sure I entirely understand your follow-up question about Chinese investment and companies with Chinese investment having an advantage. But if I can interpret it, I think the idea might be that the Chinese government won't attack companies that have Chinese investors. I'm not sure that that's accurate. The Chinese government, Chinese state-sponsored hackers attack all sorts of companies, Chinese and US alike. It's just a question of whether it has information or other forms of access that they consider to be valuable. And because the United States is an adversary of China, a lot of their targeting is going to be against U.S. companies, because U.S. companies increasingly are the locus of data related to the United States and U.S. persons.
Thank you so much. We'll take another question or two if anyone wants to submit while we wrap up here. Just wanted to ask Eric and Amit, Any final thoughts on, the best next steps for OEMs to take as they're trying to tackle all of these regulations?
I mean, I think the first thing is just to make sure you understand what requirements you face, because there is, as we've discussed, there are a number of different requirements that are emerging or already in place. They do have overlapping components, but the procedural requirements and the particular technical elements that you need to that are required for compliance with those specific regimes are different. So first step, understand which regimes you are subject to, and when those requirements are going to come into force, what those requirements are, and then you need to start identifying the steps that you need to take to address to get yourself in compliance. And last thing is, the sooner you start, the better, because waiting is not going to make anything better.
Yeah, and I see here there's another question. I will just comment on the issue of like, is it the job of the United States government to protect everyone? I think we recognize that in cybersecurity, most of the critical infrastructure, by the way, including critical infrastructure being used by the federal government. So what the federal government itself relies on comes from the private market. It's software being produced by all of us. Sometimes it's open source products that are getting, produced all over. So, there's a very clear need for regulation. So one of the actions that the US government is of course taking is making sure that if we have critical infrastructure, we have products that are being produced, that we have in place an understanding of what are those baseline security measures. And I think this is a compelling moment because you see it across the board. Is the US government also taking action to support the ecosystem, including small businesses? Yeah, but they also need the information to do so. And this is why you're seeing this focus on incident reporting, because for the US government to give back, they need what we call situational awareness. So at the same time, we're talking about everything here. It's important to know that another motivation to have in place a software bill of materials and have an understanding of your stack is just for general incident reporting regulations, which are booming. The SEC cyber rulemaking, CERCIA, etc. So I'm going to take a few questions. Security awareness within the engineering development teams. Yes. This is a big component. I think the most exciting vendors, and you talk about, what to do next. Yes, absolutely. Educate yourself early on the requirements, but also work with vendors like Finite State that invest in tracking and implementing the policy. They have Open Policy as one of their vendors, right? They're investing in actively creating products that are aligned with compliance. I think as vendors are looking at their security solution providers, they should be prioritizing companies that are helping them with their compliance mission. And we have a lot of these in our ecosystem. And I think that's a very clear way to simplify your compliance journey, is to work with compliance, regulatory-minded vendors. So that's something I would recommend. So David, to your excellent question, I think this is actually here in this space, you're seeing a lot of government investment, things like the secure by design, requirements. The reality is we need to move to a culture where we are not expecting general developers or even AI to be security aware. We need to make it easy for them. And this is where I think a lot of companies are really moving the needle on creating those products. And yeah, Eric, over to you if you want to take one last question. I know we're at time.
Yeah, just very quickly, reflecting back on when I was in government, we were afraid of imposing requirements. We promulgated the NIST cybersecurity framework, which was no requirements, but essentially a framework, guidelines for managing risk. And that was meant to do exactly what some of these questions are pointing to, is like, how do we get people to, understand what it is they need to do and actually make the movement in that direction? And, the cybersecurity framework was great in that respect, but it definitely didn't, it moved the needle, but it didn't do everything that was needed. And honestly, I have reached the point where I think that the only way to get boards, executives, CFOs to understand is to attach it to the bottom line, which is what is now happening with market access and penalties, whether in the privacy arena or in the product security arena. That gets people to sit up and take notice. And many companies are now noticing, but there are still plenty that are lagging behind. And I don't know what it's going to take.
Thank you both so much. This has been a great session. I appreciate everyone joining us. Lots of great questions. Just as a reminder, we will send the recording and the slides. We had a few people ask that, so we will definitely be getting the content out to you. Again, thank you, Eric. Thank you, Amit, and hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.